Right, and we are live.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nearly evening. Thank you very much for staying with us throughout the day. And you'll notice that we're very lucky to be joined by the fantastic Anushka Asthana. She will be answering all things about sort of politics and podcasting, given her various hats. So currently, Anushka is the host of The Guardian's daily podcast, which I listen to lots but haven't yet had the pleasure of joining. And she's also a co-presenter on ITV's Peston, which you might recognise her from the TV at the moment. She's shortly, though, due to be off to be ITV News' deputy political editor. So busy time. She was on Andrew Marsh this morning. So this might be the second time some of you today are seeing her face. Anushka, thank you so much for being with us. You'll see there's some people sort of dropping in.
Thanks for having me. I'm actually being asked to admit them. Can other people see that too? Or do I need to make someone else host?
Yeah, no, don't worry. Ben will be admitting people in the background, any late
travelers. Cool. I was thinking, do I need to do it? Okay, fine. Hi.
We wouldn't ask you to do that. We wouldn't ask you to come along and then do all the tech as well. I mean, this obviously would be a really great session to sort of get some questions from the students as well. So anyone that's watching, feel free to either raise your hand and we'll try and come to you to unmute yourself and ask some questions later on. Or you can just type in the chat box if you are still in bed at 5 o'clock. I won't judge you. So I'll kick off with a couple first. Anushka, do you want to just tell us a little bit about kind of your background and how you got to where you are and a little bit about, I guess, where you're going?
Yeah, so I obviously work for The Guardian at the moment, but I began my national career here, at The Observer when I was 23. I was doing work experience for an internship there, and I got quite lucky on a few stories and then became junior reporter and then education correspondent, health correspondent. Had a great time, absolutely loved it. I feel like I grew up in journalism there, and it was so vast. Like the very first story I ever did was being sent off to knock on a door of a family where there'd been an honour killing and their daughter had been killed, which was kind of absolutely galling. And then at the end of the week, they suddenly said, oh, actually, the Saturday Guardian's got the same stories, so we're not going to use your story after all, even though I'd gone all that way. And then my next assignment was to go speed dating. So very, very different. Anyway, I stayed at The Observer for 8 years, really, really loved it. And then I applied for a job in India, which was an example of going for stuff that you're not going to quite get just to get yourself in front of people. And I didn't quite get it, but I think I impressed them and they put me in the lobby, of course, which you know very well, Aubrey, where I was doing political reporting. And then from there, I've sort of jumped around. So I've stayed in politics, but been at the Times, been at Sky News, and then came back to be a political editor in a job share with Heather Stewart. And now I present the Today in Focus podcast, which I absolutely love. But quite soon heading off to ITV as well.
Lovely. Well, let's stick with political reporting for now then. Obviously, the lobby is this sort of incredibly strange place where there are lots of rules, customs, contacts and formalities that it takes even years of sort of being in it to fully understand. What are some of the sort of the best and kind of the worst parts of political reporting that people might not necessarily see on the surface that you kind of have discovered over the course of your distinguished career?
Well, I think the best part of it is that you are completely embedded. You're literally in Parliament. You're right where all the decision making is coming. You can walk through that building and you can bump into really senior people who are making these decisions. The number of times when Corbyn was leader, where I'd be walking through Portcullis House and he'd be there and you could just stop and chat to him. Or David Cameron or Ed Miliband, at different times, people who were really significant. Or Boris Johnson now, although I've been slightly more out of the lobby for the last 2 years. It's also, as well as all the MPs, there's just so many incredible kind of researchers and advisors and people who are just, I think trying their best. They get a really rough time, MPs, but really trying their best to do things that try and help their local communities. And obviously, if you're in the lobby, you get to do a lot of exciting stuff. You get to go on trips with prime ministers across random parts of the world. And I've had really bizarre and funny and kind of amazing trips that I've done and enjoyed. Been able to uncover some really kind of shocking things along the way, like really understand policy that's taking place. I think the worst of it is this kind of difficult line that people have to tread between, we're going to become contacts together, we're going to, you know, see you, talk to you, get to know you, but sometimes we're going to have to write really difficult things about you. And obviously it's always a kind of, how do you kind of go through that, and how do you not get too close to your contacts, in which case the journalism becomes muted because you're not willing to attack them as much, or you're not willing, not attack's probably not the right word, but to say the difficult things about them that you might need to say.
Can I ask you a little bit more then about that second half? It's certainly, I think, something that all of us will experience with sources. It's not necessarily unique to politics, but you know, those kind of difficult relationships where you're not quite sure kind of where the source bit begins and where the sort of the more kind of burgeoning friendship by virtue of just spending time together, like all day or at all times, and seeing them more than you actually see your actual friends is. How do you find that you try and sort of navigate that relationship with like kind of keeping a clear distance with your sources, and then making sure that if you do write something that they're not very happy with, that they at least understand why you have to do it in your role as a journalist?
I mean, do you know, the thing I've understood more and more is that we're all kind of grown-ups and we do understand. And that most of the time, if you write something, as long as it's fair and what you're saying is fair, people tend to be okay with that. You know, I've written things that undoubtedly are really negative about some of my sources along the way. And yet there's never been a case where I've burned a contact, as you might call it, in pursuit of a story. I've never done anything which was, you know, kind of underhand. I've just written what is true or said what is true. You know, on the one hand, you know, you might be talking to them to try and understand the story, but on the other hand, you're going to be talking to some of their opponents to try and understand the story. And your job is to try and put that together and provide the reader or the viewer or the listener with something that is a fair representation of what you're hearing. And I think largely they do get that. I've just made a piece on Hartlepool ahead of the election, which was a really deep dive for the podcast into like what has gone wrong in Hartlepool. And I tell you what, you know, I bet the Labour teams didn't find it particularly easy listening. This was ahead of the election. And actually one of the comms officers from the North texted me to say, I'm just about to listen to the podcast, I'm on the way to Hartlepool. And I replied and said, well, it might not be great listening for you, I'll be honest. And then a little bit later on, basically said, you know, not great listening, but you know, fair enough. There was some things in there that really hit the nail on the head. And I do think there is that understanding on all sides that you have to do your job and they have to do their job. I think to some extent, those relationships have to remain on the contact side of the line rather than on the friendship side of the line. Once they go into the friendship side of the line, it becomes much more difficult to do. And I definitely think there have been examples in the past, I'm not going to name anyone, but where political reporters have become too close to their contacts, and then what you get isn't really what you would hope to get. I mean, one big debate we have at The Guardian is whether you should actually use sources, you know, whether you should be allowed to say sources rather than who it is. You know, there are times where sources that have been used widely across the media are quite clearly Dominic Cummings representing Boris Johnson, or Lee Kane representing Boris Johnson, or Ben Nunn representing Keir Starmer. And the question to the reader or to the listener is, why can't you just tell me who that is? If they want to criticize someone else, they should be able to do it under their name, or at least under their official position. It's a really interesting debate, I think, because on the one hand, I agree with that. But then on the other hand, you're going to get less information that way. And if what you want to do is give your readers information about what's going on, sometimes they have to trust you to use sources in order to tell the story, even if those sources are not willing to go that one step further and get on the record.
The sources frustration is one that I experienced, or I understood more and more, particularly when things issued by government spokespeople are issued as government source quotes in, you know, there is a time and a place for that, but it felt like increasingly that was being used, and you were like, why isn't this being attributed to a spokesperson? Even
Yeah,
if they're
I
not.
agree. Yeah, I agree. I mean, if it's literally the Prime Minister's right-hand man, then they should be willing to say who they are, especially, and I think this is where The Guardian takes a view on this, especially if what they're doing is criticising someone else. You know, if we're going to use a quote criticising another person, it is not really acceptable for that to be a completely anonymous source.
Absolutely. Well, we could keep going on about that all day, but obviously we've talked a lot about sources. People kind of listening into this, mostly sort of students, a couple of graduates, they'll be right at the start of their careers, and probably the first thing they're thinking is, I really want to get into political journalism, but I haven't got those sources yet. Or if I've got the sources, they're maybe kind of on councils, like councillors, council press officers, bit sort of smaller fry than kind of at the most kind of top level. What are some of the ways then that you think people can kind of approach trying to find and dig out political stories that means they can have new, original, creative, exclusive stuff that can mean that they've actually got something to talk about and present as part of a portfolio?
Well, I think through exactly what you're talking about. And sometimes it's not just about getting to know councillors, it's also getting to know MPs in certain areas. I used to sit in a room with loads of people who worked for an agency that wrote news for various local papers, and the local MPs were more than willing to talk to them because the local coverage of them was just as important as what I might be writing in the national news. And do you know what you do? You get to know people, and then they climb the ladder. And, as someone said to me once, and then one by one, your people get into quite senior positions. So, I was in the lobby before 2010. So I got to know all the Tories, or a lot of the Tories who are now sitting in the cabinet, when they were just new MPs and they were willing to talk to someone like me, who at the time was much more junior. And, you maintain those relationships over time. And then one day they get into a job that's quite useful to you. And I think that is one thing to bear in mind, that actually, even if those people are not in amazing positions at the moment, they probably will be at some point. And secondly, so it's partly about picking winners, but secondly, usually local councillors or local press officers or local MPs give you good stories because they are on the ground in their constituencies, getting to know what is going on where they are. And they're the people you need to talk to try and understand what people care about, what they want changing in their lives, and how MPs are going to try and do that. They also probably have fairly good access to what's going on within their parties. So I think just getting to know the kind of MPs in an area where you might be working, if politics is what you want, is absolutely key. And just recognizing that stories come from all sorts of places. Think about trade unions, think about charities. I mean, I've got so many political stories through charities over the years. Think about the kind of other types, like who's on the NEC, for example, who might not be an MP but might have some really interesting information to give you.
Fantastic. And obviously we've talked quite a lot there about sort of Westminster politics. Presumably there is so much more importance as well in people taking up roles covering national politics in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, and kind of at a regional level as well. So kind of what's the importance, do you think, there of people filling those roles? It's not just about Westminster, presumably.
Absolutely not. And if anything, we are rightly criticised for being too Westminster and London centric. I mean, it is the problem. It's the problem that the Labour Party's got, and it's a problem that the media's got. It is a very, very hard balance to get right, because on the one hand, being in Westminster is very, very useful because that's where the MPs go for 3 or 4 days a week, and all of them are there and you can talk to them and get to know what's going on. But until you're actually in other communities or finding out what's going on within those communities, you can't report on it properly. So Northern Ireland's a good example. Like, how many lobby journalists go to Northern Ireland? Not many at all. So it becomes even more important that the people based in Northern Ireland are providing the news and the kind of on the ground stuff going on over there, obviously, which includes, their own parliament, as well as what's going on in terms of the relationship with Westminster. I mean, to some extent, I used to, and I still think this to some extent, that as a Westminster journalist, you need to be getting out across the country, but also for an organisation, they need a team in Westminster, and they need that team to work together with the teams all over the country. So, for example, we've got a North of England office, and we try and work with them all the time to try and do stuff, because we know that they have a better sense of what's going on in a lot of northern constituencies than the team based in Westminster necessarily would have. And the same for on the podcast. It's been actually quite nice during the lockdown that a lot of our team have been based in different parts of the country, but actually one of them, Josh Kelly, who I do a lot of stuff with, he's a producer, he's now permanently based in the Northeast, which when we were doing Hartlepool, which is his hometown, just made it amazing what level we could take it to in terms of understanding what was going on. Because it wasn't me being parachuted in for a day, it was Josh living that story week after week after week.
Sounds fantastic. Yeah. Tell us a bit more about the podcasting side that you sort of moved into. Obviously, you did have some broadcast experience before at Sky, so it will have been slightly kind of similar in terms of, you know, it's broadcast, but obviously it is different formatting. It's sort of chopped up differently. You're creating an audio-only product. How did you sort of find that transition, and are there any sort of lessons that you've learned now you're coming to the end of doing that job?
I mean, I've absolutely loved it. And we've got an audience that skews heavily to the under 35s, which makes me think, you know, younger people are absorbing their news in a completely different way. You've seen the figures for TV news. It's really falling among younger audiences, and podcasts like ours are doing incredibly well. It's longer form, so you can be really in-depth. In terms of its broadcasting style, it's totally different than what I do. You know, at the moment, I still do ITV once a week, which is a very much stand-up broadcast on TV in a very kind of traditional format, I guess. Whilst on the podcast, I'm just sitting and chatting to people and having a completely different conversation with them. You know, over the next 2 days, we've done a two-parter that has totally enraged me, which is about the post office scandal. If you get a chance, listen to it. If you don't know the story well, which I think we should all know well, and I can't believe that I didn't know it better, because it is one of the greatest scandals of our time. And one of the people who I spoke to was one of the sub postmasters who was affected by the scandal. And we spent an hour, no, in fact, we spent 2 hours talking to her. And she really cried a lot through the interview. And she said she'd never cried. She's done loads of interviews. She'd never cried before. And I think that's partly because in audio, and especially when you're able to do longer format, you know, these are together an hour-long product that we're putting out, you can just take on a completely different style. It's like much less kind of, we need to right now get this story in this moment. And it's much more, we can kind of have this long, relaxed, non-confrontational chat, and we can really understand what's going on. It's much more empathetic than stuff I've done before. In fact, I keep going on about the Hartlepool piece, but it was really funny because I saw ITV News had done a package on the 10 o'clock news the other day, and they'd used two of the people that we spoke to. And each of those people had got 30 seconds on the news. And whilst with us, we'd, you know, spent 20 minutes talking to them. And it just made me realise that, you know, although I am obviously excited about my new job, there is a certain depth to podcasting that I'm going to really miss.
And obviously, you were saying that the audience for the podcast is quite young, like under 30s, very heavily. We've got a lot of kind of people here who'll be of that age, but also looking to sort of produce content, make podcasts for that age group as well. Maybe even sort of, you know, it's basically the 18 to 21 mark. You know, how much of a market do you think there is for it? And have you got any sort of tips for kind of appealing to young people and drawing them into a conversation that they are traditionally sort of shut or left out of?
I mean, we have been told from our figures that we skew under 35. Anecdotally, in terms of the people who get in touch with me about the podcast, a lot of them are 16 to, I would say, 24. So it makes me feel like we have quite a lot of really quite young listeners. And there's nothing we do that deliberately targets young people, which makes me think that, and I've always thought this, that deliberately targeting young people isn't the way to target young people. You know, there was another BBC version of us that launched at the same time called Beyond Today, which was trying to target young people. And I thought, this might be a bit unfair between us, I thought they dumbed down a bit in order to do it, and perhaps had a slightly more patronising style. And I just don't think that is necessary, because I think young people just are really interested in politics, really willing to listen to long form, really willing to engage with the subject, and judging by the feedback I've had, you know, really into it. I mean, I think what people probably get from listening to Today in Focus rather than watching the TV news is they are used to consuming media from all over the world, because people are used to, increasingly, if you're young, using your phone and just dotting through podcasts. And it doesn't matter if they're made in the US or anywhere, you just get them on, or watching, you know, stuff via Netflix or other kind of apps rather than necessarily watching traditional live TV. That makes a big difference, because it means they're listening to the US content, which is way ahead of UK content, and much more likely to be sound designed, very heavily produced, much more likely to think hard about audio storytelling and narrative, which is something we think really hard about now, which I don't think traditional TV news in the UK thinks as hard about. And so we have to match that if we want to compete, because we're not just competing with the BBC and ITN, we're competing with The Daily from the New York Times and This American Life and all the other amazing podcasts that are coming out of the US.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I've seen the first one's come into the chat, so that sounds like a good encouragement for everyone else to get in there. The last thing I wanted to ask you about with podcasting is kind of the breadth of the episodes, and how do you decide kind of how much to focus on a specific topic or topics within topics? You know, if you're doing a kind of a specific topic across a whole episode, but then you're looking at it from 3 ways. How much breadth do you sort of generally take when you're looking at producing an episode?
So the absolute key, and we don't always do this, but this is the absolute key to something that works well in the format that we do, is narrative. So we're trying to tell a story, and we have to find an angle that's going to tell that story. So once in a while, the news demands that we just do a very simple, straight Q&A on something huge that's happened. Say, government changes COVID rules. Everyone wants to understand what's going on. We might just do a simple Q&A. But beyond that, we're always looking for an angle. Ideally, the most unique kind of sideways angle that we can come at to try and tell the story in a narrative way. You know, the example I'll give you recently is we did a 5-part series on something called Freshwater, which was like a true crime series. And to get people through what is not 5 hours of content, but I think 3 hours of content, you have to be taking them through a narrative. You have to have characters, you have to have suspense, you have to have cliffhangers. And if you don't have that, you're going to lose people. So what we are absolutely not is a sort of Radio 4 style chat show that is stretched over half an hour. What we are is a sort of like a kind of trying to almost like do audio storytelling over half an hour, but melding it with the news of the day or the news of the week. So for example, with the post office, big news story, but we're trying to say, okay, well, let's take you back to 2000. Let's go to Hull, be in a post office in Hull in 2000 with a woman called Janet Skinner, and let's go on her journey with her, rather than necessarily get the experts in this story sitting around a table and discussing it.
And it's very good that you brought up the example you did, because Anna Willis said, "Hi Anushka, thanks for speaking to us today. Could you tell us about how you put together Freshwater, which has been one of her favourite podcast series to date? So how did you put it together? Let's hear a bit more about that."
So for those who haven't heard it, it's a true crime story based on the Isle of Wight, and it involves 5 men who were sentenced to 104 years for one of the biggest cocaine hauls in the country. And Josh Kelly, who I mentioned, who's the producer I did Hartlepool with, this was his baby. And he came up, he sort of, Mark Townsend, one of our colleagues, had written about it in the Observer, and he was like, this is a really interesting story. And it's got everything, you know, it's got dark, stormy nights, 4 men out at sea, you know, cocaine thrown off the side of a ship and then wrenched up into a kind of little fishing boat that comes back in gale 8 winds and then flings the drugs into the sea and then comes back, and then they all get arrested. They say they're innocent, and they've said they're innocent for 10 years. And the person who comes to represent them is this amazing lawyer called Emily Bolton, which was another thing that made us attracted to it, because you have this great character in Emily who'd come from Louisiana, where she'd set up an innocence project trying to get people off death row, and then came here and set up an organisation to look at miscarriages of justice. And this case appealed to her beyond all others. I mean, it had everything you could imagine. It had twists and turns, cliffhangers. She had done an amazing investigation into what might have gone wrong with this case. And one thing that I didn't realise would be good, in fact, I stressed out the whole way through the production that it would be bad, is that no one was sure whether they were guilty or innocent. It's not like you come to this and think, absolutely sure they're innocent. It's really tough, and it's kind of thorny, and it's ethically questionable. And there are bits, there are moments where I think, oh, they're guilty. And there are moments where I think, oh, maybe they're not guilty. But there is clearly examples of corruption in there, regardless of whether they're innocent or guilty. And there are clearly big problems with their conviction. And so all that stuff that I sort of struggled with in the process, actually, I think helps the product, because it means that the listener's with you thinking, are they innocent? Are they guilty? So we had this thing where, you know, by the end of episode 2, you are absolutely convinced these guys were guilty. And then through episodes 3 and 4, we started to pull apart the different parts of the case. to question whether they might be or they might not be. I mean, we never tell you one way or another, but if you've heard it through, it obviously goes to the Court of Appeal. And it was amazing because I was so emotionally invested in it. It was so hectic getting it done. The fact checking process was like nothing I've ever done before. We had to check every individual line of 20-page scripts over 5 episodes. Our lawyers were just going over it and over it and over it again. We were doing it ahead of a Court of Appeal case. And, at one point we thought they were going to stop us from putting it out because the Court of Appeal, we thought we're going to, the prosecution went for reporting restrictions. And then I sat through the Court of Appeal. In case anyone's not seen it, I won't say what happened, but that was like an emotional roller coaster too. So it had everything that you need for audio storytelling, and we just need to find the next one in order to do it.
Goodness me, well, you've advertised it very well. Everyone who hasn't heard it is going away to listen to it after this call. Lauren's got a question here, which is probably something you're asked about quite a lot. Obviously, the job share that you did at The Guardian with Heather Stewart was, she says, quite a breakthrough for women in journalism. Do you think that after the pandemic, there'll be more flexibility when working in journalism, or is a return to offices more likely? And that's, I guess, quite interesting, specifically in the context of journalism rather than just kind of workers more.
I mean, I'll say 2 things on that. First of all, certainly from the point of view of the podcast, I don't think that we will continue to work 100% remotely as we do now, but I absolutely think that we will now know that there's so much more we can do remotely, and therefore we can be more flexible. So if I was staying in this job, I think I would do a little bit more of, scripting from home, leaving a little bit early, seeing the kids, and then maybe scripting in the evening, or kind of the things that you can do to work around, especially when you've got 3 kids like I have, to try and see them as well as do your big job. I mean, post working with Heather, I am evangelical about job shares, because there's no better way to really make a job like that available to people like us who were women with pretty young children. There had never been, in fact, I think I don't even know if there had been a female political editor on a national daily, that there had been the odd person on a Sunday, maybe one before us on the Mirror. And the reason for that is often, and I'm not saying that this should be the case, because I think men should also have this problem if they've got kids, is that by the time you get to the seniority level to be going for a political editor role, a lot of women, not all, but a lot will have children. And suddenly doing the job of political editor feels like it's too big a compromise for your kids. So it was absolutely amazing to be able to do it together, because what we did was we said one of us was always the political editor, and we overlapped, and the other person on the days when we overlap would be in the background doing other things, and just have to totally trust the other person to make the decisions as the political editor. For the news desk, it meant they always had a political editor, because they had 2 of us for the price of 1. It meant that you didn't get the days later in the week where the political editor was exhausted and the deputy needed to come into the fray. It was just like they always had a political editor, and they had a good deputy, Rowena at the time, who was absolutely brilliant. And we were able to come and see our kids. And we had these mad days where, like, I remember that one day where Heather, it was the Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq war, and Heather went to the lock-in in the morning, and I was literally at, sports day at my son's nursery whilst Chilcot was happening. And then at like 12, I jumped on the train, got in, and I think it was something mad. It was like Michael Gove's leadership bid speech or something. And I went straight in there, and Heather went back to parents' evening. And so we massively made it work. And then, when I decided to come over to Today in Focus, my motivation was that I wanted to be back in broadcast. By that point, Heather was in a position, her kids were a little bit older, where she could really take on the job by herself. And so it really worked for both of us to bridge that period in between.
I guess then it's a bit of the luck of the draw about your employer, because, we might all sort of wish to have that kind of divvying up of responsibilities and bosses who kind of understand enough and will accommodate. But, there's a reason that it was a sort of certainly a national first, and it hasn't seemingly since been repeated. So fingers crossed.
I mean, the editor-in-chief of The Guardian, Catherine Viner, had done sort of more behind the scenes, I guess, but very senior managerial roles at The Guardian had been done as a job share. And I actually spoke to the people who had done that before we did this to try and get an understanding of how we could make it work. She has really championed it. And I think the difference is you've now got a lot of women in quite senior roles across The Guardian, which you may not have had if there hadn't have been that way. And similarly, they sort of did the job shares for a while, and then they've taken on roles separately. I do think more employers will open up to that as an idea. Because the thing is, you don't get the best of someone if you expect one person to work 6 days a week, most day and night. It just doesn't, those people are not as productive as they would be if they actually had a better work-life balance.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question for a bit more on the sort of podcasting side is from Matthew, who wants to know how much they're edited when they're put together. He says he's done several podcasts and he never knows what to cut out, as the guests say so many interesting things, meaning the episodes can get quite long. So how many questions, and he also says, how many questions do you send your guests in advance? A few things.
I tend not to send guest questions in advance because I don't want people to plan the answers. It doesn't sound natural. We do send structures, so they know like what story we're telling and the order in which we're doing it. And often that will be based on our conversations with them, because 9 times out of 10 for us, they are our own journalists and they're part of the production process. We normally record at least for an hour, hopefully not massively more than that. And the idea is to produce a 25-minute podcast. Sometimes we end up recording hours of tape. In fact, for Freshwater, we had hours and hours and hours and hours of tape that was really brought down. We just kind of picked the best out of all of it. I'm very much of the view that like do more, and then you get the best stuff and use the best stuff, even if you have to be brutal and cut stuff out. It does mean sometimes if we, like you, Matthew, occasionally think, oh, I really like that bit and I really like that bit, the length of the episodes creeps up. I do actually think we should probably pull ours down a tiny bit. I mean, if it's worth 30 minutes, by all means, we should do 30 minutes, but often it isn't. And then you just get a bit flabby with it. I think you've got to be quite strict where you can be. Think about your audience, think about how much they're going to listen to, and make sure that you give them the best of it, is what we try and do. And normally we have a very, very big kind of collaborative thing. So there's a pre-interview with the journalist, then I do the interview, which we record, then an editor will take it and do a first pass on it, might bring it down to 40 or maybe 30 minutes. We will then do a group edit, myself, the person who was editing it, and the producer basically of the piece, and one of the executive producers on Today in Focus. We then go through it again and we try and pull it down. We try and get rid of any of the fat around the edges. Then the producer will start putting in archive clips from different news sources, etc., to try and lift the piece. And then we go through it again. If we have time, we don't always have time for this bigger process. Then we go through it again and once more try and just trim out anything that feels too much. And I think that kind of group process really helps, because often the producer themselves is too close to it to know by the end which bits can go and which bits can't. Try and be very strict, no repetition, nothing. If there's any point at which when we're listening back to it, we feel it's dragging even slightly, then we try and be quite strict on that, because the whole point of a narrative podcast is that you've got to take the listener with you very smoothly from A to B. So the New York Times Daily is the absolute kind of king or queen of narrative, and they do it brilliantly. You don't get bored, you don't think, oh, this is going on too long. It's always just perfect, and that's the kind of panacea, if you like.
Yeah, so not being sort of afraid to be slightly more ruthless. And I guess, at the start of these interviews, people are a little bit more kind of tongue-tied, or they're not quite as comfortable. So maybe kind of just not seeing everything that they say at the start as kind of gospel, and maybe letting them sort of unwind slowly, and then we can sort of ask them the questions again once they're a bit more kind of lucid and
exactly, yeah. Just like let them relax into it, definitely.
Yeah. Lauren asks, back on political reporting, if you've got any advice on starting out while trying to make contacts at the moment, while it's trickier to meet people in person. Constant sort of bane of everyone's life, I guess, at the moment. So
it's sort of, well, actually, I found this helps me make contacts in a way, because now you can do video calls with everyone. Suddenly it's more convenient. Like before, to get an MP, you basically have to get them on a Monday or a Tuesday, but now they seem to be able to do any day, because you can chat to them from anywhere in the country. I think if we can carry on with a bit of that, so it's not all in person, that actually might help us to be able to get to know people better. I mean, the other thing to say is, and I've taken ages to come around to this, is just be a bit bolshy. Like, don't be shy of getting in touch with people. Like, some of the people whose bylines you see in the papers every week getting amazing stories. They just call and they call and they call and they call. They call the Downing Street press office 3 times a week. They call, whoever it is they think might have the answer to what they want again and again, and they are really not shy on it. So, if there are particular stories that you're going after, just call the people who you think might have a line on them. I mean, the other thing to do is to choose a topic and then go after the people who might be most useful. So say you want to do something on mental health, go to a mental health charity, talk to the press officers at the charity. And then from there, they might tell you, okay, well, there's this all-party political group who are looking at this. So then look at that group, go down the list, look at what names are on there. You might find that some of them are on there because they've got personal stories they want to tell. Maybe contact their offices as a way to get through to people. I mean, it is hard when you don't have I don't know if you do or don't have a publication to say, this is why I'm calling. So it's probably sometimes quite good to have a specific story that you're working on or trying to build up.
I have to say as well, I mean, I've encountered that people are sort of more willing to certainly reply to messages, even if I've never met them before, because everyone's kind of just conducting everything virtually. And it's not so much like they'll only kind of tell people that they happen to bump into that they already know in a corridor in Westminster somewhere. People are sort of just much more used to operating virtually and speaking to people they've never actually met face to face. So genuinely, I think just kind of cold calling and texting people has been people have been more receptive than I think they would have been before the pandemic.
That's interesting. Are you still completely remote?
Half and half, kind of as much as I like, really. But obviously, I do like going into Westminster, but the press gallery was very cold at various points in February and March. So there are a few days when I thought, actually, I think I'll prefer to be at home today. I'm aware we haven't got that much longer, so there's one more question here. If anyone's got any last-minute ones, do drop them into the chat. Miranda says, digressing slightly from the 2 specific subjects we've talked about, sort of politics and podcasts, have you got any sort of thoughts on trust in journalists and journalism, and how much of it is an issue, and how can it sort of be repaired? She cites the example of a YouGov poll last year that said that 2/3 of respondents said they didn't trust TV journalists. So she says, do you think podcasts could be good for trust by making current affairs feel more personal for listeners? It's a really interesting question.
I mean, 100%. The difference between my Twitter feed when I do ITV compared to when I do the podcast is just unbelievable. I get all positive feedback through the podcast. Everyone is really great, really thoughtful replies. I get emails, and then you kind of just get a load of abuse when you're on TV. And I've watched in this past year as people like Aubrey and others have done the kind of, asking the questions of the politicians. They just get so much abuse online, particularly, Laura Kuenssberg, Robert Peston, Beth Rigby. It's just kind of almost quite painful to watch. They always seem to be trending whenever they ask a question. It's like trust in journalists have just fallen to a level that we haven't seen for a long time. And I think trust in journalists in the UK has always been quite low. I briefly worked in America in 2006, and I was amazed by how much everyone was opening the door to you, talking to you, completely trustworthy of you. I think it is because to some extent we have a slightly more abrasive relationship, particularly with our contacts in politics. In America, they're more deferential. They stand up when the president enters the room. We don't stand up for Boris Johnson or David Cameron or, Gordon Brown, which is the first prime minister when I was in the lobby over here. Now, what has happened in recent years is that, this kind of the kind of trend we've had with Brexit, with Trump, this kind of anti-establishment trend, well, we've been seen as part of that. We are seen as the establishment. We're not trusted. People don't trust what we do. And it is so incredibly important for us to rebuild that, because you have all this fake news on the one hand, and then you have these trusted sources on the other. And if people don't trust us, then they're going to see us as exactly the same as that. And that makes, for a kind of quite dangerous landscape when it comes to journalism. I think podcasting can help, because I think there is something about the format which is so non-confrontational, and it's so in-depth, and it's so kind of trying to understand rather than trying to get a story, that it does just make people have a more positive reaction. I think there's something about the kind of gotcha journalism as it is seen of TV journalism and of print journalism that kind of people don't like. That said, it can be really important. I had this conversation recently when we were doing a podcast on the Netflix documentary Seaspiracy, which is all about overfishing and whether or not we should eat fish. And some people have really criticised it for gotcha journalism and for making a few mistakes. And I interviewed Guardian columnist and sort of legend George Monbiot about it. And he was like, that's the sort of journalism that gets results. And his argument was that actually, normally what people do is they don't address the big issues. They don't take on the vested interests. And, you know, what this documentary in his eyes, I don't totally agree with this, in his eyes had done, is it had gone for people who he thinks have been behaving badly for many years, including NGOs. And in doing so, it got people to really think about a big issue, which was overfishing. And so it was a bit of food for thought, which is gotcha journalism isn't always just there for style. Sometimes it is there for substance as well. It's just a shame that people at the moment feel so kind of, I don't know, disenfranchised or apathetic. I'm not sure what the word is, but they're not willing to give us the benefit of the doubt right now. And I think it is up to us to rebuild it. And for example, the way in which we use sources is quite important, that we began by talking about, because that is the sort of thing that people don't trust. And if they don't trust us, they're not going to believe what we say. And so it is incredibly important that we get through that. All that said, I do think social media completely distorts the real view of what people listening or watching or hearing are actually thinking. The vast majority of people probably think something completely different to the people screaming on social media, but they still probably need to trust us a little bit more. Or we need to earn their trust.
The final question I had was just if you had any kind of headline top tips for kind of student journalists kind of coming out thinking, I want to get into either podcasting or sort of political journalism, kind of top 3 things or qualities that you think are sort of best to try and focus on?
I think, so the things to focus on, I think the future is going to be all about storytelling in different formats, rather than necessarily, you know, TV news versus radio news versus print news. So I think what you need to try and understand and learn is how to tell stories. So any opportunities you get on any format, I wouldn't worry what it is. And I've done this. I've been in all formats that you can imagine. You know, I've done magazines, I've done newspapers, I've done TV, and I've done audio. Get those opportunities, take them, and really, you know, go for it with them. And, you know, think about when you're doing those opportunities, who are the good characters? Who can tell this story? Whose voice is going to be interesting to the people who are listening? So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is to just be quite bolshy, as I was saying, put yourself forward, go for opportunities when you see them. When you're in places, when you're doing work experience, take opportunities. Sometimes that means you have to do the crap stuff. You know, I spent a lot of time doing kind of boring stuff, admin stuff for other journalists. But, you know, in that, I also then got opportunities to do proper journalism. It doesn't mean being exploited. Obviously, don't allow yourself to be exploited, but just try and get into places and make the most of what you've got. And then finally, you know, do your own journalism whenever you can. Find your own stories, read the trade press, read local papers, try and meet local contacts and try and talk to them about what is happening in those communities, and then look for ideas that you can then pitch to different organisations.
All incredibly helpful tips. There's one more question that's gone into the chat, so I'm going to ask if you've got time to answer it or if you need to shoot off.
Sure. No, that's fine.
Fantastic. Right, Lauren asks a quick question on the topic of sources. She says she's encountered once or twice a situation where someone will speak on the record, but then subsequently, before the story's actually been published, they'll change their mind and ask for the information not to be used. How do you navigate that situation?
So in theory, if somebody has said something's on the record, you can use it on the record. The problem is, and it's a big problem, that person's probably more important to you in the future, that it's not just about, you know, what they say now. You want to be able to continue talking to them in the future. And so if they suddenly decide they don't want to use it, then you've got to really think about what it would mean for you to use it, because it will probably mean they're not going to talk to you ever again. And if they're someone who's useful to talk to, then you might need to think about it. I mean, I would try and have a conversation with them, particularly if it's a particularly good bit of information about what you could do. But I do think you've got to be very careful to think about it in the longer term and to think about what it might mean. Also, to try and make people understand what it is like to be, for example, on the front of a newspaper. It's not easy, especially if that person isn't someone who's used to it and knows what it is. I always remember when I was at the Times, I did an interview with a Tory MP who had cerebral palsy. And he actually told me one day when we were drinking in Strangers Bar in the House of Commons, you know, I was there with other people, and he was telling this story about how he had been jeered, like his disability had been made fun of in the House of Commons chamber, which was just sort of unbelievable. And I said, "Oh gosh, will you do an interview?" He said, "Yes." He did a big interview with me. The Times then put that on the front page, and he ended up in an absolute media storm. And I think, you know, with hindsight, he probably wasn't in a position to be able to take that. He had no idea what he was walking into, and he was so taken aback by what happened. I think it actually affected him for a long, long time. I mean, there was never a case there where he said, "Can we take this off the record?" But when somebody is asking that of you, you do need to think about why they're asking it and whether anything you do can create any harm for them. I think we have a massive responsibility for the people we talk to, particularly the ones that are not in the public eye, to protect them when they go into a kind of journalistic situation.
Very, very sage advice. We've talked a lot about how sort of it's important to kind of look after your own mental health as a journalist, but making sure that actually your sources are kind of going into things eyes wide open and aware of the consequences is very important as well. So with that, I'm aware we kept you slightly too long, but it was very, very kind of you to stay around. And I know that the people watching on the YouTube stream as well will be really pleased, and everyone who will be watching the recording later on will find so much use from it. So thank you so much. Have a lovely rest of your Sunday. And to everyone else who's on here, I'll just say that the awards for the tonight, our big kind of Pierre de Resistance of all the hard work over the last year, are at 7 p.m. So you can watch that on YouTube, and if you've been shortlisted, you'll get a Zoom link as well. And Anushka, hopefully you can see everyone piling into the chat saying thank you and super interesting. So
thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And good luck to everyone.
Thank you. All right, all the best.
All right. Bye.
Cheers.